Have you ever stopped to think about what it would be like to grow up in a world where every step could be the last? Where the childhood you dreamed of never existed and every decision could cost the life of someone you love? Carl Grimes lived exactly that, and his story shows us something that no one likes to admit. Sometimes, surviving is not victory. It is carrying a weight that no one teaches you how to carry. But what is most surprising is that even surrounded by death, fear, and betrayal, he finds a way to keep his humanity, to connect with what remains of hope, and to build his own identity. It is paradoxical, it is painful, and perhaps it is the greatest lesson we can learn about growing up too fast. How to keep the courage to feel when everything around you teaches you to turn into stone. If you are a fan of cinema psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel now so you do not miss any video. But before that, comment down below which character you want me to analyze here on the channel. Now let us go to the video. Who is the character? Carl is not just Rick's son, and anyone who reduces him to that loses half of the experience. He is the child who is born in an ordinary world and grows up in an impossible one, where maturing is not an option, it is a sentence. While other children learn how to ride a bike, Carl learns how to aim a gun without shaking, and that, let us be honest, already says a lot about how his mind was shaped. There was no conscious choice, only forced adaptation, the kind that happens when reality does not ask for permission. And, deep down, that is where the psychological root of everything he will become later begins. At the beginning, Carl still carries that curious look of someone who believes that adults always have the answers. He trusts his father the way someone trusts the ground they walk on, without thinking twice. But the world around him begins to show that the ground can give way at any moment. Each walker, each loss, each sleepless night slowly breaks that illusion. And look, this is very similar to real life, just in slow motion and without flesh-eating monsters. Who has never discovered that the superheroes of childhood make serious mistakes too? The most interesting thing is that Carl does not become strong overnight. He is pushed into it. His strength is born from fear, insecurity, and that constant feeling of, if I do not grow up now, I die. Psychologically, this is brutal because there is no room for childish mistakes. He cannot make mistakes like a child because mistakes cost lives, including his own. And when we take away the right to make mistakes, the mind starts to operate in permanent survival mode. This is not healthy maturity. It is maturity under pressure. Notice how his silence becomes heavier over time. At first, Carl talks more, asks more, exposes himself more. Later, he starts to observe, to calculate, to keep things to himself. This is typical of someone who learns too early that words can be dangerous. It is like that child who grows up in an unstable home and becomes too good just to avoid causing problems. Carl does something similar, only in the middle of the apocalypse. He understands that being discreet is a form of protection. And then comes that delicate point. The loss of innocence does not happen all at once. It slowly drips away. Each death he witnesses is like a small piece of childhood being torn away without anesthesia. His brain starts to create its own logic, where chaos is normal. This completely changes the way he understands right and wrong. It is not that Carl stops having values, it is that his values begin to follow different rules from ours. And that is fascinating from a psychological point of view. If we bring this into reality, it is like when someone grows up too fast because of early responsibilities. You know that person who at 10 years old already acts like an adult? Carl is that on a maximum scale. He had no choice, only response. And every emotionally accelerated response leaves marks that stay hidden, waiting for the right moment to appear. Sometimes as courage, sometimes as coldness, sometimes as a confusing mix of both. The body grows, but the soul keeps trying to understand what happened. As a psychologist, it makes you want to sit with Carl and ask, when did you stop feeling like a child? Because that moment, even if he cannot answer it, defines a lot. That is where rigidity is born, premature seriousness, and even that slightly lonely posture he develops. He is not isolated because he wants to be. He is isolated because he learned that depending too much is dangerous. And let us be honest, that hits hard for anyone who was disappointed early in life. But this beginning of the journey is still only the surface. Behind the boy who tries to be strong, there is an internal war that grows more intense every day. Because growing up fast solves the problem of now, but it charges an emotional price later. And it is exactly when this price begins to appear that Carl's story becomes truly deep. And that is when the next topic comes into play. Conflicts and internal traumas, the conflict of loss. When grief becomes part of identity, Carl learns very early that loss is not the exception. It is the routine. It is not only losing people, it is losing the sense of safety, predictability, of a guaranteed tomorrow. Each goodbye piles an invisible weight inside him, as if his emotional backpack were never emptied. And what is curious is that he does not cry like a common child, he swallows it. Because in that world, crying for too long is a dangerous luxury, so his grief becomes silent, compact, and persistent. Carl's brain begins to associate attachment with pain. The more you love, the more you suffer later. This creates an almost automatic defense mechanism: feel less to hurt less. But feeling less also means living less. It is that classic psychological trap, like if I do not get attached, no one can hurt me, but at the same time, no one truly reaches you. How many people in real life live exactly like this, building walls, thinking they are protecting themselves? Notice how he becomes more serious after each loss. It is not coldness, it is emotional containment. He learns to control reactions like someone controlling their breathing underwater. Sooner or later, the air runs out, but until then, he holds it. This creates a boy who seems older than he really is, because his mind is always managing damage. It is not full maturity, it is emotional survival disguised as maturity. And there is an important detail. Carl has no time to process grief. There is no pause, no therapy, no moment of let us talk about this. The world keeps demanding decisions, vigilance, courage. It is like someone who loses a loved one today and tomorrow already has to work normally, smile, solve problems, only multiplied by 10 with walkers in the way. Pain becomes the background of his existence. This explains why sometimes Carl seems to act impulsively or strangely detached. It is not lack of feeling, it is excess poorly processed. When the mind accumulates too much pain, it starts choosing emotional shortcuts. Either you harden or you break. Carl chooses to harden because breaking in that world means dying. Psychologically, it is a choice of survival, not of comfort. If we bring this to reality, think about that person who has gone through so many disappointments that they start saying, "I expect nothing from anyone." That is not strength, it is emotional exhaustion. Carl carries this exhaustion from early on without even knowing how to name it. He does not say, "I am emotionally exhausted." He just moves forward. And moving forward is sometimes the only language pain finds to keep existing. The saddest and most beautiful thing at the same time is that, even so, Carl still tries to love. He still creates bonds, still cares, still puts himself at emotional risk. This shows that his heart did not close completely, it just became more cautious. It is like someone who has fallen off a bike several times but still gets back on it, only now with more fear and more attention. Trauma does not paralyze, but it changes the way you move. But loving in a world where everything dies quickly creates a gigantic internal tension. It is like living between two poles, wanting to connect and wanting to protect yourself. This ambivalence begins to shape Carl's most complex decisions. Because, at some point, he will have to choose between what he feels and what he believes is necessary. And when that happens, the conflict will no longer be only about loss, but about who he is becoming. The conflict of morality. Growing up without a manual of right and wrong, Carl grows up in a world where the old rules died along with civilization. There is no more police, school, clear laws, or that collective voice saying this is wrong, this is wrong. What remains is a moral void, and someone has to fill it. And, without realizing it, Carl begins to build his own ethical code from chaos. It is not based on books or stable social examples, but on survival, protection, and loyalty. It is as if he were writing a manual of morality in the middle of a fire. At first, he mirrors Rick completely. His father becomes compass, judge, and reference. But the problem is that Rick is also lost, just on a more sophisticated level. So Carl learns a morality that is emotionally unstable, shaped by difficult decisions, often contradictory. It is like learning mathematics from someone who is still discovering their own formulas. It works, but it leaves many cracks in understanding. Carl's mind begins to deal with questions that not even adults can answer properly. Is it wrong to kill if it is to protect someone? How far does my responsibility go? When does compassion become weakness? These questions are not philosophical for him. They are practical. He does not think about them sitting down. He lives them in his body, in fear, in the weight of the trigger. Each decision becomes a brick in the construction of who he believes he needs to be. And then comes a delicate point. When a child has to decide about life and death, something inside them ages too fast. Carl begins to see himself less as a son and more as a soldier. But soldiers are not trained to feel, they are trained to act. This creates a distance between who he is and what he does, a silent crack that grows deeper over time. In real life, this happens when someone grows up taking responsibilities that were not meant for their age. The person learns to function before learning to feel. Later on, they realize they are great at solving problems, but terrible at dealing with their own emotions. Carl lives exactly this, only in an extreme scenario. He acts with efficiency, but his heart becomes overloaded. What is most curious is that, even so, Carl tries to preserve humanity. He questions, he hesitates, he shows discomfort. This shows that his moral sense did not die, it is just in conflict. It is as if there were two voices inside him, one saying be strong or die, and another saying be human or be lost. And balancing these two voices is an almost impossible task even for emotionally structured adults. This conflict creates decisions that, from the outside, seem contradictory. Sometimes he is too harsh, sometimes he is too compassionate. But this is not incoherence, it is moral experimentation. Carl is testing limits, trying to understand who he can be without completely destroying who he still is. It is the emotional laboratory of a young mind in absurd conditions. And as this moral code forms, it begins to clash with what others believe, because the way Carl sees the world is no longer exactly the same as Rick's, nor that of the adults around him. And when a son's vision begins to diverge from his father's, something much bigger than obedience comes into play: identity, choice, and the first real spark of independence. The conflict of identity, when he stops being just the son and starts being himself. There comes a moment when Carl is no longer just an extension of Rick, and that changes everything inside. He begins to realize that he cannot live only by repeating what his father does or believes. It is like when we grow up and notice that we are not obliged to think the same way as our parents, even loving them deeply. This is not rebellion, it is the construction of identity. And for Carl, this construction happens in the middle of chaos, with real risk to life. He begins to observe Rick with a different look, less idealized and more critical. It is not that he stops admiring his father, it is that he begins to see the flaws. And when the reference figure falls from the pedestal, the internal world shakes strongly, because now there is no longer a ready manual of how to act. He has to decide for himself who he wants to be in that broken world. Psychologically, this is huge. It is the moment when the child becomes a subject, not just a follower. Carl begins to form his own opinions about violence, compassion, limits, and forgiveness. He does not want to be only strong, he wants to be fair. And being fair in an unfair world is one of the hardest missions anyone can take on. It is like trying to keep your clothes clean while walking in mud. This conflict makes him question decisions he would have accepted without thinking before. He begins to feel discomfort with certain actions, even when they seem necessary. It is like that internal feeling of something here is not right, even when everyone says it is. That internal voice is the birth of identity. It is the beginning of the I, separate from the we. In real life, this appears when we start saying, "This works for you, but it does not work for me." Carl does this in extreme situations, but the psychological mechanism is the same. He is trying to align behavior with internal values, and when that does not happen, anguish appears. Because living disconnected from who you are hurts more than facing external danger. What is interesting is that Carl does not want to destroy his father's legacy, he wants to improve it. He carries Rick's strength, but tries to mix it with something more human. It is as if he were saying without words, it is possible to survive without becoming a monster. This attempt at balance is the essence of his identity. It is not denying the past, it is transforming its meaning. But that creates tension. Because every time Carl chooses differently from Rick, there is a huge emotional risk. The risk of disappointing, of entering into conflict, of separating symbolically. And symbolic separation is one of the hardest parts of growing up. That is where the son becomes an individual, and that hurts as much as any physical wound in that world. And when he begins to sustain this identity of his own, choices arise that are no longer just about survival, but about purpose, about what kind of person he wants to be if the world keeps existing. And when the question stops being how to survive and becomes how to live, the psychological game changes completely and prepares the ground for an even deeper conflict, the conflict of guilt. When surviving starts to weigh more than dying, Carl carries a silent guilt that almost no one notices at first. It is not that loud guilt full of tears, it is the guilt that hides behind "I had to do this." Each hard decision leaves an emotional trail, like footprints in the mud that he pretends not to see but knows are there. Surviving when others cannot creates a dangerous question: why am I still here? And that question slowly eats away at him. He begins to feel that every choice has a moral price. There is no clean decision. There is no complete victory. Even when he does what is necessary, something inside him tightens. It is like winning a war and losing a piece of his own soul in the process. Psychologically, this creates a constant state of internal vigilance, as if he were always judging himself, even in silence. In real life, this appears when someone feels they had to be too hard in order to protect themselves. The person survives, but then wonders if they crossed some invisible line. Carl lives exactly that, just in an extreme version. He does not see himself as a hero, he sees himself as someone trying not to fail morally in a world that almost forces failure. It is a constant emotional tension between what was done and what he wishes he had done. This guilt shapes the way he looks at others. Carl begins to act with more empathy, almost as if he were trying to compensate for something. It is that unconscious idea of, if I save someone today, maybe I balance what I did yesterday. It is not a rational strategy. It is a deep emotional movement. The heart tries to settle accounts that the mind cannot calculate, but guilt can also turn into rigidity. In some moments, he becomes more serious, more closed off, more demanding of himself, because deep down, he believes he no longer has the right to make mistakes. And when someone believes they cannot make mistakes, they live in a state of permanent tension. It is like walking on an emotional glass floor where any misstep feels fatal. The heaviest part is that no one validates this guilt. There is no one saying you did the best you could, so it grows in the dark without being named. Carl learns to deal with it alone, like someone carrying an invisible backpack full of stones. You can walk, you can fight, you can survive, but it is exhausting, and very exhausting. Many people in real life live something similar. People who had to make hard decisions too early, take care of someone, be strong too soon. On the outside, they seem firm. On the inside, they keep judging themselves not to stop. Carl represents this kind of strength that no one asked to have, but was forced to develop. And that creates an emotional adult in the body of a child. And when guilt starts to mix with the desire to do things differently, something new is born inside him, a wish to leave the world better than he found it. Not out of heroism, but out of emotional repair, as if in some way he were trying to heal his own heart through future choices, and that is exactly where the next conflict begins to take shape. The conflict of hope. Believing in a future when everything proves otherwise, Carl begins to develop something that, in that world, feels almost like an act of rebellion. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything will turn out perfect, but the stubborn hope that it is still worth trying to be better. It is like planting a flower in a battlefield, knowing it might not even survive, but planting it anyway. Psychologically, this is powerful, because hope is what prevents the mind from sinking into total cynicism. Without it, surviving becomes just existing, and existing without meaning is a slow kind of death. While many adults around him begin to act on autopilot, Carl goes in the opposite direction. He starts to imagine an after, even without knowing if that after will come. And that changes the way he looks at present decisions. It is no longer just about winning today, but about building something that will be worth it tomorrow. It is like someone who, even in debt, still sets aside a little money to invest in the future. It seems crazy, but it is exactly what keeps a person standing. This hope is born from pain, not from fantasy. Carl does not believe because he is optimistic. He believes because he has suffered too much to accept that everything was for nothing. It is that emotional logic of, if all this leads to nothing, then it makes no sense to go on. Many people in real life work like this. It is not joy that sustains them, it is meaning. When suffering finds purpose, it stops being just suffering and becomes strength. But hope also hurts, because to hope is to expose yourself to frustration. Carl allows himself to believe, and that makes him vulnerable. In a world where disappointment is the rule, being hopeful is almost like walking without armor. It is more beautiful, but also more dangerous. Psychologically, this shows enormous courage. The courage not to harden completely. He begins to act as if his choices could influence a better future, even without guarantees, and that changes everything. Every gesture of compassion becomes a seed. Every different attitude becomes a silent protest against chaos. It is like saying, without words, you may have destroyed the world, but you will not destroy who I choose to be. In real life, this appears when someone who suffered a lot decides not to reproduce the same pain, like someone who had a difficult childhood and promises to be different with their children, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Carl carries exactly this impulse, not letting the brutality of the world completely define his essence. But there is a hidden risk in that. When you believe too much, you can also be disappointed too much. And Carl's mind starts to split between protecting his heart and feeding hope. It is a strange emotional dance, one step forward, one step back. He does not want to be naive, but he also does not want to turn into stone. The most beautiful thing is that this hope does not come in grand speeches, it comes in small actions. A gesture of empathy, a refusal to kill when it is not necessary, a look that still recognizes humanity in the other. They are details, but details build worlds. Psychologically, this is where his identity begins to gain an almost symbolic dimension. But when hope starts to shape his choices, it also begins to clash with the harsh reality around him. And there comes a moment when believing in the future is not just an internal posture, but a decision that can put everything at risk, and that is the point where the next conflict appears in full force. The conflict of sacrifice, when protecting the future costs the present. There comes a moment when Carl understands something too heavy for his age. Some choices are not about winning, they are about losing in the right way. It is no longer how do I survive, but what am I willing to give up so that others can survive better? Psychologically, this marks the transition from instinct to purpose. He begins to act like someone who thinks beyond himself, beyond the now, beyond his own fear. It is when survival becomes responsibility. This kind of conflict is cruel because there is no comfortable choice. Sacrificing something always hurts, even when it makes sense. Carl begins to carry the idea that sometimes being strong is not fighting, it is letting go. And letting go, let us be honest, is one of the hardest things the human mind can do. The brain hates losing, hates giving in, hates putting itself second. So when someone does that, it is not weakness, it is a rare kind of courage. In real life, this appears when someone chooses to take care of a sick person, when they give up a personal dream to protect their family, when they hold their own pain to be emotional support for someone else. It is not movie heroism, it is silent heroism. Carl begins to enter this emotional place, where the value of his own life is not measured only by what he lives, but by the impact he has on others. But this conflict also brings a big psychological risk, the erasure of the self. When someone gets used to sacrificing themselves, they can forget that they also deserve care. Carl runs this risk all the time. He begins to see himself more as a means than as an end, as if his existence only had value if he were saving someone. That little by little can become a heavy emotional trap. Notice how his way of being changes. He becomes calmer, more centered, almost too serene. For someone so young, that is not complete peace, it is acceptance. He accepts that the world will not be fair, but decides that he can be. And this difference between the external world and the internal world is where conscious sacrifice is born. It is like saying, I do not control the chaos, but I control who I am inside it. Psychologically, this shows rare maturity. Carl no longer acts only by reacting, he acts by choosing. And choosing hurts more than reacting, because you know exactly what you are losing. When someone reacts, it is automatic. When someone chooses, it is responsible, and emotional responsibility is one of the hardest weights to carry. At the same time, this conflict strengthens his identity. He is no longer just the boy who survived. He is someone who wants to ensure that others can live differently. This completely changes the meaning of his existence. It is no longer an escape from fear. It is a commitment to an ideal, and living for an ideal gives meaning even to pain. But living for something bigger than yourself also puts you in a dangerous position, because the more you care, the more you expose yourself to suffering. Carl begins to walk this thin line between love and self-sacrifice. And when that line becomes too thin, the next question almost arises on its own. How far is it worth going for what you believe in? The conflict of humanity. How to remain human in a world that teaches you to turn into stone. Carl lives a silent battle that is harder than any physical fight, staying human in a scenario that rewards coldness. Because, let us be honest, in that world, those who feel more suffer more. So the natural logic would be to harden, close the heart, and become almost a survival machine. But Carl does the opposite. He insists on feeling, not because it is easy, but because he understands that losing his humanity would be a greater defeat than losing his own life. He realizes that it is not only the body that can die, the soul can too. And dying inside, in this case, would be becoming exactly what the apocalyptic world tries to shape. Someone without empathy, without connection, without real hope. Psychologically, this is an act of resistance. It is like someone who decides to be kind in a toxic environment, even knowing that it can hurt. It is not naivety, it is a conscious choice. In practice, this appears in small attitudes. In the way he looks at people, in the care he takes when making decisions, in the attempt to preserve dignity even in the most tense moments. It is as if Carl were constantly saying, I can live in this hell without becoming it, and that is absurdly difficult. Because the brain, when under constant threat, wants to simplify everything into black and white, enemy or ally, risk or safety. In real life, this conflict appears when someone goes through trauma and decides not to become bitter. When someone chooses not to take their pain out on others, that requires an emotional strength that almost no one values. Carl represents this silent strength, the kind that does not show up in screams or explosions, but in calm choices made in the middle of chaos. But maintaining humanity is exhausting. It is exhausting to feel, exhausting to care, exhausting to be disappointed. It is much easier to turn into stone than to remain living flesh. That is why, sometimes, Carl seems heavy, reflective, distant. It is not apathy, it is effort. It is the constant effort not to let himself be completely numbed, and that is a kind of exhaustion that few people can name. The most beautiful thing is that he does not do this for applause, nor for recognition. He does it because, deep down, he knows that without humanity, there is no future worth having. There is no point in surviving if the world that remains is inhabited by empty people. Psychologically, this shows that he thinks of tomorrow not only as continuity of life, but as continuity of values. This conflict also shows how Carl is, paradoxically, more adult than many adults around him, because emotional maturity is not only about making hard decisions, it is about not abandoning who you are while making those decisions. And that is what demands the most inner awareness. He does not want only to be efficient, he wants to be whole, even if it costs more. But holding on to your own humanity in a brutal world creates an almost unbearable tension. Because there comes a time when you have to decide what will weigh more, your essence or your immediate survival. And when that choice approaches, it does not come as a clear thought. It comes as a tightness in the chest, as a heavy silence. As that feeling that something definitive is about to happen. And that is when Carl's emotional story reaches its most delicate point. So, what did you think about diving into Carl Grimes' mind and understanding all these conflicts that shaped who he became? Can you see how growing up too fast, carrying guilt, hope, and sacrifice can transform anyone? Tell me in the comments, which of these conflicts did you identify with the most, or which other character would you like us to analyze in the next video? And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to keep learning about these complex, layered characters, because there is still a lot of story for us to explore together.